Good day, everyone. Today, we're going to explore a very important shift happening across nearly every industry in the modern economy. This presentation is called Beyond the Gatekeeper, and the core idea is simple. Markets are changing because consumers no longer depend on traditional middlemen to receive value. For decades, industries controlled access through licenses, platforms, institutions, and tightly protected systems. But technology changed the relationship between consumers and value delivery. Today, if consumers still receive the outcome they want and the transaction still happens successfully, the old gatekeeper may no longer be necessary. This is not just happening in one sector, it is happening in transportation, media, banking, education, retail, and real estate. What we'll examine today is the difference between protecting a process and actually delivering value. And ultimately, we'll show why value itself is medium independent. This is Steve Koleno, and this is Confidential Remarks. This slide illustrates what I call the gatekeeper paradox. Legacy industries often become so focused on protecting their existing system that they lose focus on the actual purpose of the market itself. The market was never supposed to exist to preserve the intermediary. It exists to create outcomes for consumers. But when industries become heavily invested in controlling access, they begin redefining validity around the process instead of the result. In real estate, for example, traditional systems historically argued that transactions were only legitimate if they passed through specific channels or professionals. But consumers are increasingly asking a different question. They're asking, did I get the outcome I wanted? If the answer is yes, then the market begins shifting toward whoever can deliver that value faster, cheaper, and more efficiently. And once that shift begins, protecting the old structure becomes increasingly difficult. This framework explains how disruption repeatedly happens across industries. First, incumbents attempt to lock down the market through protocols, restrictions, or legacy systems. Second, those protections create friction. They make the process slower, more expensive, or more difficult for consumers. Third, consumer needs remain unmet because the system prioritizes preservation over convenience. And fourth, innovation enters the gap. This is the critical insight. Disruption is often not created by technology alone. It is created by unnecessary friction. When consumers feel blocked, delayed, overcharged, or constrained, innovators begin building simpler pathways around the gatekeeper. And ironically, the harder the incumbent fights to preserve the old system, the stronger the opportunity becomes for a disruptive alternative to emerge. This addresses one of the most common misconceptions in legacy industries. Gatekeepers often argue that a transaction is only legitimate if it follows a historical process or traditional format. But consumers rarely care about the format itself. They care about the outcome. The reality is that value does not depend on the medium through which it is delivered. The same destination can be reached through a completely different path. Streaming replaced cable. Digital banking replaced branch dependency. E-commerce replaced physical storefront exclusivity. The value remained intact even as the delivery mechanism evolved. And history repeatedly shows that industries defending the old format eventually lose to systems that prioritize efficiency, accessibility, and consumer convenience. What makes this conversation so important is that this pattern is not isolated. It repeats almost everywhere. Transportation, lodging, media, retail, finance, education all experience the same underlying transition. The delivery channel changed, but the consumer objective stayed constant. Consumers still wanted transportation. They still wanted shelter. They still wanted information, products, financial access, and education. The need never disappeared. What changed was the efficiency of the system delivering it. This slide establishes the diagnostic rule for understanding disruption. If the consumer still receives the intended value, the old intermediary becomes optional rather than essential. And once consumers realize that, markets begin reorganizing around convenience, speed, cost reduction, and direct access. Now we begin testing the framework against real-world industries. In transportation, traditional systems argued that mobility was only legitimate through licensed taxi structures. But peer-to-peer mobility platforms demonstrated that consumers primarily cared about getting from point A to point B efficiently. The outcome still occurred. The consumer still received value. The transaction still happened. The same pattern appeared in lodging. Legacy hotel systems once controlled access to temporary accommodation markets. But distributed hospitality platforms unlocked unused inventory and created more flexible consumer options. Again, the core value remained unchanged. People still needed reliable shelter. The gatekeeper changed, but the consumer outcome did not. That distinction is incredibly important. The same transformation happened in media and retail. In media, cable systems once controlled how audiences accessed entertainment and information. But on-demand streaming and creator platforms eliminated many of those barriers. Consumers still acquired information and entertainment, just through a more direct and flexible system. Retail followed the same trajectory. Historically, physical storefronts controlled product access. Today, direct-to-consumer digital procurement allows brands to reach consumers instantly without relying on traditional retail structures. Again, the outcome remained constant. The product still arrived. The consumer still received value. The transaction still occurred. This repeated pattern across industries strongly suggests that market validity is not tied to legacy distribution channels. Now we move into financial systems and education. Payments once depended heavily on physical cash or paper-based systems. Today, digital settlement platforms allow transactions to happen instantly across global networks. Banking experienced a similar shift. Consumers increasingly access financial services through digital interfaces rather than physical branches. And education has perhaps undergone one of the most dramatic transformations of all. Knowledge transfer is no longer confined to physical classrooms. People now acquire skills through online platforms, distributed learning environments, and digital communities. Across all three examples, the same validation checklist remains true. The outcome occurred. The value was received. The transaction happened. The gatekeeper was bypassed, but the consumer objective was still fulfilled. This matrix summarizes the broader pattern we've now observed across multiple industries. Each sector originally developed gatekeeper structures designed to control access. But over time, modern systems emerged that delivered the same underlying value more efficiently. Transportation evolved toward frictionless transit. Hospitality evolved toward distributed shelter access. Media evolved toward on-demand information acquisition. Retail evolved toward direct procurement. Finance evolved toward instant settlement and capital mobility. Education evolved toward democratized skill mastery. The important takeaway is this: consumers consistently prioritize outcomes over institutional preservation. Markets reward systems that reduce friction and improve accessibility. And once consumers experience a superior model, returning to the older system becomes increasingly unlikely. This presents the core framework behind the entire presentation. A valid transaction only requires three things. First, the intended outcome must be achieved. Second, value must successfully transfer to the consumer. And third, the transaction itself must occur. Notice what is absent from this framework: the protocol, the intermediary, the historical process. Those are not requirements for validity. They are delivery mechanisms. And when delivery mechanisms become inefficient, markets naturally evolve towards systems that accomplish the same outcome with less friction. This is the foundational principle behind nearly every major disruption cycle we've studied today. Value is medium independent. When consumer needs are fulfilled successfully, the delivery channel becomes secondary. Legacy systems often attempt to preserve themselves by redefining legitimacy around historical structures. But markets consistently move toward efficiency. Consumers reward systems that reduce friction, improve accessibility, lower costs, and simplify outcomes. This is not simply a technological trend, it is a structural market evolution. And the organizations that adapt to this reality will thrive. Those that attempt to preserve friction as a defensive strategy will eventually face disruption from more consumer-centric alternatives. This has been Confidential Remarks.